Model refused to sit next to a black teacher until her Korean Mafia boss had her removed mid-flight. The Indian Ocean stretched endlessly below, 38,000 feet of indifference between the aircraft and the water. Inside the private jet, silence had a different quality. The kind of silence that wealth purchases, that power commands, that ordinary people never experience. Seo-yoon Han understood this silence intimately. She had existed in it for a decade. Back when her face launched perfume campaigns in Paris, when her body sold luxury in Tokyo, when photographers shouted her name and stylists fought over her schedule. Back when being beautiful was enough to make you matter. That was before the younger models. Before the contracts started specifying age ranges that no longer included her. Before classic beauty became industry code for past your prime. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses, though there was no sun inside the cabin. The gesture was reflex, armor she'd worn so long it had fused to her skin. The fashion magazine in her lap remained unopened. She'd already seen the spread. A 19-year-old with her same bone structure and none of her history, wearing the expression Seo-yoon used to own. Youth was a currency that depreciated in real time, and Seo-yoon could feel herself becoming invisible with each passing season. This flight was a gift, a connection through her agency, a seat on a jet owned by Taehyung, some tech investor whose name carried weight in rooms she wanted to re-enter. Wealthy men with ambiguous empires had always been her ecosystem. She knew how to exist in their world without asking questions that might exile her from it. The jet's door opened with a pneumatic hiss. Seo-yoon didn't look up immediately. She had perfected the art of calculated disinterest over 15 years of being watched. Let them come to her. Let them work for her attention. But when she finally raised her eyes, she saw a woman she hadn't expected. Eshe Anas stepped into the cabin carrying a satchel that had seen better years and a children's book with dog-eared pages. She wore a navy blazer that spoke of dignity without needing to announce it, and her natural hair framed her face with an ease that required no stylist, no product, no performance. She was beautiful in a way that made Seo-yoon uncomfortable. The kind of beauty that didn't require validation, didn't beg for cameras, didn't seem to understand it was supposed to be competing. Eshe smiled politely, genuinely, and moved toward the seat beside Seo-yoon. Something cold flickered in Seo-yoon's chest. Not quite anger, not quite fear. Something older and uglier that she had learned to disguise in polite cruelty. She placed her Birkin bag on the empty seat with deliberate slowness, the leather settling like a verdict. "I don't sit next to strangers," Seo-yoon said, her voice carrying that false sweetness that had ended conversations for years. "Find somewhere else." Eshe stopped. She glanced at her boarding pass, then at the seat number above the chair. "This is 3A, Eshe said quietly. "My assigned seat." Seo-yoon sighed as if patience itself was being tested. "There are other seats available. I'm sure you'll be more comfortable elsewhere." The flight attendant stood frozen 3 feet away, her training manual offering no protocol for this particular brand of violence. Behind them, the cabin door remained open, and through it stepped a man who changed everything. Before we dive into what happened next, and trust me, the karma here is chef's kiss. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you love stories where the universe corrects itself, subscribe because this channel is built for you. Eshe Anas had learned long ago that the world would try to make her smaller. She was 8 years old the first time, standing in her grandmother's kitchen in Accra, surrounded by books her teacher had given her because this one actually reads. Her aunt had looked at the stack of novels and shaken her head. "All those big ideas," she'd said, "won't put food on the table." But Eshe had kept reading anyway. By 23, she was teaching literature in schools where the ceiling leaked during rainy season and students shared textbooks in groups of 5. By 30, she was working 3 jobs, morning classes at a public school, afternoon tutoring sessions for exam prep, evening workshops teaching adult literacy at the community center. The worn satchel she carried onto Taehyung's jet, it held lesson plans written on the back of donated paper, a laptop held together with electrical tape, and a children's book she'd read so many times the spine had surrendered. That book was her anchor, her reminder. Education over ego. Always. The world had tried to teach her different lessons. At academic conferences in Nairobi and Lagos, hotel staff assumed she was catering. Wealthy donors at fundraising dinners shook every hand in the room, hers last, and only when someone introduced her as the teacher who actually does the work. She'd smile, say thank you, and return to her students the next morning. Because that's where she mattered. That's where she was seen. 3 years ago, during the political riots that turned across streets into war zones, Eshe had been preparing for evening classes when she heard the screaming. The school 2 blocks away, a private language center where expatriate families sent their children, had caught fire. Smoke poured from the second floor. People ran past, phones raised, recording the chaos. Eshe ran toward it. Inside, through the smoke, she found a young Korean woman trapped behind a collapsed door frame, flames crawling up the walls. The woman was crying, choking, her blouse already singed. Eshe didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't consider that the roof was groaning, that the fire was spreading, that she had no training for this. She grabbed the woman's arm and pulled. The door frame wouldn't budge. Eshe braced her foot against the wall, felt something crack in her ribcage, and pulled again. The woman came free. They stumbled through the smoke, Eshe's lungs burning, her vision blurring. The heat so intense it felt like the air itself was attacking them. They made it out 17 seconds before the roof collapsed. Paramedics wrapped Eshe's ribs. The Korean woman, Min Seo, she'd said her name was, held Eshe's hand and cried and promised she would never forget this. Eshe had smiled through the pain. Just be safe. That's enough. She never asked Min Seo's last name. Never asked where she worked or who her family was. Never mentioned it to anyone except her grandmother, who'd prayed over her broken ribs and called her stubborn and blessed in equal measure. 2 weeks later, Eshe was back in her classroom, teaching metaphor and symbolism to students who would change the world if someone just gave them the chance. She didn't know that Min Seo's brother owned half the shipping routes in East Asia. Didn't know that he'd spent 3 years searching for the woman who saved his sister's life. Didn't know that the boarding pass in her hand, gifted by a foundation supporting educators in developing nations, had been personally arranged by a man she'd never met. Now, standing in the aisle of his private jet, staring at a designer handbag occupying her seat, Eshe felt that familiar tightness in her chest. Not anger exactly, weariness. The kind that came from being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that her presence required permission, that her worth was negotiable, that somewhere else would be more appropriate. Seo-yoon was still scrolling through her phone, the bag still claiming the seat, the message clear, "You don't belong here." Eshe could have argued, could have called the flight attendant, could have made this woman see her. But she'd learned something in those underfunded classrooms, in those smoke-filled hallways, in every space where she'd been underestimated. Dignity didn't require an audience. She stood quietly beside the seat, her satchel held close, her spine straight. "I'll wait," she said simply. And in that moment, choosing calm over confrontation, presence over performance, Eshe Anas became impossible to ignore, because the cabin door had just opened again, and Taehyung had just stepped inside. Seo-yoon Han had once been untouchable. At 19, she'd walked her first runway in Seoul, a local designer, a modest crowd, but the photographer from Vogue Korea had been in the third row. By 21, she was opening shows in Paris. By 25, her face sold everything from Swiss watches to Japanese skincare. Her name whispered in the same breath as the legends. She had lived in penthouses with views that made visitors dizzy, dated men whose last names appeared in financial headlines, worn dresses that cost more than cars, then discarded them after a single event because repetition was for people who had to budget. The world had bowed, and Seo-yoon had mistaken that bow for permanence. The decline came quietly at first, a campaign she didn't book, a callback that never came, her agent's voice shifting from excited to encouraging, that subtle tone change that meant they were managing expectations instead of celebrating certainties. Then the younger girls arrived, 18-year-olds with her cheekbones and none of her mileage, girls who looked hungry because they were, who moved with urgency because time hadn't taught them to fear it yet, girls who didn't understand that the industry would devour them too, eventually, but whose ignorance made them fearless. Seo-yoon watched her Instagram engagement drop. Watched brands she'd represented for years announce fresh faces for their new campaigns. Watched magazines run retrospectives of her career, the past tense already creeping into the headlines. Seo-yoon Han. A look back at iconic moments. She was 32 and already being archived. The luxury remained, for now, but it felt rented rather than owned. The invitation still came, but with an asterisk. Stylist's choice, seated second row, influencer tier instead of celebrity. This flight was supposed to be different. Private jet. Proximity to real power. A chance to remind herself and anyone watching that she still had access, still mattered, still belonged in rooms where ordinary people were kept out. When Eshe Anas walked down that aisle, Seo-yoon saw everything she feared. Not the woman herself, not really. She saw proof that the barriers were failing. That the exclusive spaces she'd clawed into were now accessible to people who hadn't earned them the way she had. People who didn't understand that luxury required sacrifice, that beauty was labor, that status had to be defended or it would disappear. Eshe's modest blazer offended her. The worn satchel was an insult. The quiet confidence, that ease of simply existing without performing, felt like a personal attack. If this woman could sit beside her, then the seat meant nothing. If this woman belonged here, then Seo-yoon didn't belong anywhere. Her racism wasn't the screaming kind. It wore the mask of aesthetics, of standards, of sophistication. She would have told you, convinced herself, that this wasn't about race. It was about fit, about appropriateness, about maintaining the caliber of spaces that were meant for people of a certain level. She'd perfected this language in casting rooms and VIP lounges, where prejudice dressed itself in euphemisms and everyone pretended not to notice. The handbag on the seat wasn't just territorial. It was survival. If she let Eshe sit, let this stranger in her unremarkable clothes claim equal space, then Seo-yoon became just another passenger. Interchangeable, irrelevant. And irrelevance was the only thing she feared more than aging. So she made her choice. She would rather humiliate someone publicly than feel invisible privately. She would rather be cruel than unremarkable. She placed that bag with deliberate precision, looked at Eshe with manufactured pity, and delivered the rejection she'd been practicing in different forms for years. I don't sit next to strangers. Find somewhere else. The power felt good, felt familiar, felt like control in a world where she was losing her grip. What Seo-yoon didn't calculate, what her fear made her blind to, was that humiliation only works when you're the most powerful person in the room. And she wasn't. Not even close. The cabin temperature didn't drop when Taehyung entered. It just felt like it did. He moved with the economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion was wasted power. Charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like armor. Hair cut sharp enough to draw blood. And that scar, thin, deliberate, tracing his jawline from ear to chin like a signature written in violence. But it was his stillness that commanded the room. Men who shout are performing. Men who whisper are dangerous. Taehyung didn't need to do either. His presence simply rearranged the space around him, made everyone recalibrate their breathing, their posture, their assumptions about who held power here. The flight attendant straightened unconsciously. A businessman 2 rows back closed his laptop without being asked. Seo-yoon's entire body shifted. Shoulders back, chin lifted, smile deployed like a weapon she'd sharpened for exactly this kind of encounter. Taehyung, she purred, her voice honey smooth. You're late. He didn't answer her. His eyes had already found Eshe. She stood beside the disputed seat, satchel pressed to her chest, face calm but tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying other people's cruelty for too long. Her posture held no aggression, no performance of victimhood, just waiting, just existing in a world that kept asking her to prove she belonged. Taehyung's gaze moved from Eshe's face to the designer handbag occupying seat 3A, then back to Seo-yoon. Is there a problem? He asked. His voice was quiet, conversational even. That's how you knew it was dangerous. Seo-yoon laughed, light, dismissive, the sound of someone who believed charm could reshape reality. Oh, just a small confusion about seating arrangements. I've already sorted it. Sorted it? Taehyung repeated, the words carrying no inflection at all. She was confused about where she should sit. Seo-yoon continued, gesturing vaguely toward Eshe as if she were an inconvenient piece of furniture. I explained that there are other seats available. Taehyung studied Eshe's face for 3 seconds that felt like minutes. Something shifted behind his eyes, recognition clicking into place like a lock tumbler finding its position. You're Eshe Anas, he said. Eshe blinked, surprised. Yes. The memory was 3 years old but sharp as broken glass. His sister Min Seo's phone call from the hospital. Her voice shattered by smoke and tears. Teacher saved me. She ran into the fire. I don't even know her name. The months he'd spent searching through school registries, hospital records, news footage. The private investigators who'd finally found her. Quiet, unglamorous, teaching literature to students the world had already written off. He'd been trying to find a way to thank her that wouldn't insult her dignity. And here she was, on his aircraft, being told she didn't belong. Taehyung turned slowly to Seo-yoon. The temperature really did drop this time. Move your bag, he said. Seo-yoon's smile faltered. What? That seat belongs to her. Taehyung, I don't think you understand. Move. Your bag. Each word was a door closing. Seo-yoon's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, then the beginning of fear. You can't be serious. You're choosing her over. I'm choosing decency. Taehyung interrupted, his voice still quiet, still calm, still absolutely final. You are on my aircraft. You insulted someone under my protection. You will not sit beside her. The cabin held its breath. Every passenger suddenly found something fascinating about their seatbacks. Seo-yoon's hands trembled as she snatched the handbag back onto her lap. Her face had gone pale beneath her foundation. Her carefully constructed composure cracking like expensive porcelain dropped on marble. Taehyung gestured to the empty seat. Ms. Anas. Eshe moved past him, her steps careful, and settled into seat 3A. She placed her satchel at her feet, folded her hands in her lap, and looked straight ahead. No triumph, no gloating, just the quiet relief of someone who'd been standing too long. The plane began to taxi. Outside, the runway lights blurred into streaks of gold against the darkness. Inside, Seo-yoon leaned toward the flight attendant and muttered, loud enough to be heard, desperate enough to be pathetic. Anyone can buy their way into places now. Standards don't mean anything anymore. Taehyung heard every word. He pressed a button near his armrest. Captain, he said, his voice carrying the weight of empires built in shadows. Return to the terminal. The jet slowed, and Seo-yoon's world began to end. The jet slowed. Not dramatically, not suddenly. Just the subtle deceleration of physics obeying a command that shouldn't have been given. Seo-yoon's head snapped toward the window. The runway lights were moving backward. The terminal was growing closer instead of smaller. What? She started. Taehyung's finger was still on the intercom button. His eyes were on her. Flat. Final. We're returning to the gate, he said. You're leaving. The cabin air went thin. A businessman 3 rows back stopped breathing. The flight attendant's clipboard clattered to the floor. Even the engine noise seemed to pull back, as if the aircraft itself was recoiling from what was about to happen. Seo-yoon's laugh came out wrong. Too high, too sharp, breaking at the edges. You're joking. I don't joke about my aircraft, Taehyung replied. You can't just... She stood abruptly, her handbag sliding to the floor. You can't humiliate me like this. Do you know who I am? I know exactly who you are, Taehyung said quietly. Someone who mistakes cruelty for class. Someone who thinks status gives you permission to diminish other people. Seo-yoon's face flushed scarlet beneath her makeup. Over her? Over some. She caught herself, but the word hung in the air anyway, unspoken but heard by everyone. Choose your next words carefully, Taehyung said. They'll be the last ones you speak on this aircraft. The jet rolled to a stop. Outside, ground crew scrambled into position, confused by the unexpected return. Inside, Seo-yoon looked around the cabin desperately, searching for allies, for witnesses, for anyone who might validate that this wasn't happening. No one met her eyes. "This is insane," she hissed, her voice cracking. "I've flown with heads of state. I've been invited to. And now you've been uninvited from my jet," Taehyung interrupted. He nodded to the flight attendant. "Help Ms. Han with her belongings." The attendant moved mechanically, retrieving Seo-yoon's carry-on from the overhead compartment with shaking hands. Seo-yoon snatched it away. "You'll regret this. My lawyer will. We'll tell you that I can remove anyone from my private property for any reason I choose," Taehyung finished. "The door is behind you." The cabin door hissed open. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and tarmac. Below, maintenance workers had stopped mid-task to watch. Someone had a phone out. The light was unmistakable. Cameras, recording everything. Seo-yoon realized it in the same moment everyone else did. Her exit wouldn't be private, wouldn't be quiet, wouldn't be something she could reshape into a more flattering narrative later. This would be documented, shared.
Permanent.
"You're destroying me," she whispered, tears finally breaking through her armor. "No," Taehyung said. "You did that yourself. I'm just refusing to be part of it." Seo-yoon turned toward Eshe, her face twisted with something between rage and desperation. "You're really going to let him do this? You're just going to sit there?" Eshe looked at her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something sadder and older. The look of someone who'd seen this story before, who knew how it ended, who wished it could have gone differently. "I hope one day," Eshe said softly, "you learn that worth isn't measured by who you push down." The words landed like stones in still water. Seo-yoon's mouth opened, closed. No comeback, no defense. Just the terrible recognition that she'd lost something she couldn't name and would never get back. She clutched her suitcase and stumbled toward the stairs. The descent took 15 seconds. Each step was photographed from 3 different angles. When her feet touched the tarmac, the cabin door sealed shut with the finality of a vault closing. The engines spooled up. The jet turned back toward the runway. Through the window, Eshe caught a glimpse of Seo-yoon standing alone beneath the terminal lights. Designer luggage at her feet, phone pressed to her ear, the flash of cameras turning her humiliation into content. Then the jet accelerated and she was gone. The cabin remained silent for a long time. No one celebrated. No one spoke. They'd all just witnessed something that felt less like justice and more like surgery. Necessary, painful, leaving scars on everyone present. Eshe opened her worn satchel and pulled out her book. The children's story with the broken spine and dog-eared pages. She began to read. And 38,000 feet above the Indian Ocean, the world kept turning. The video went live at 11:47 p.m. Seoul time, 18 hours after Seo-yoon's removal. A maintenance worker had filmed it, shaky footage through a terminal window but clear enough. Audio muffled but comprehensible. 38 seconds that would be dissected frame by millions. The caption was simple. Supermodel kicked off private jet for racism. By midnight, it had 100,000 views. By 2 a.m., 2 million. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Hashtag Seat 3A trended first. Someone's poetic reference to the seat that started everything. Then hashtag private jet karma. Then hashtag unbothered teacher. Accompanied by screenshots of the moment that broke the internet. Eshe, after Seo-yoon's removal, simply opening her book and reading. No statement to camera. No victory lap. No Instagram story capitalizing on her vindication. Just a woman who'd been disrespected, defended, and chose to spend the remainder of her flight doing exactly what she'd planned to do anyway. Exist peacefully. The internet had never seen anything like it. Twitter threads dissected every angle. TikTok creators reenacted the confrontation with increasingly dramatic flair. Instagram infographics appeared explaining the history of racial discrimination in luxury spaces. LinkedIn thought leaders posted about grace under pressure and authentic leadership. But it was the split-screen comparisons that went nuclear. Left side. Seo-yoon on the tarmac, tears streaking her makeup, phone pressed to her ear. surrounded by luggage and photographers. Right side. Eshe reading, back straight, face calm, completely unbothered. The caption that accompanied most versions. One woman demanded respect. One woman commanded it. Within 48 hours, the consequences arrived in waves. Chanel dropped Seo-yoon from their spring campaign. No statement, just her face quietly removed from their website, replaced by someone younger, safer, less controversial. Dior followed 6 hours later. Estee Lauder issued a press release about values alignment and brand integrity. Her talent agency released a terse statement. We have mutually agreed to part ways. Translation. They dropped her before she could resign. Seo-yoon's Instagram lost 400,000 followers in 3 days. Her remaining fans begged her to apologize, to explain, to do something. She posted an apology video 72 hours after the incident. Professional lighting, makeup perfectly applied. Sitting in what appeared to be a luxury apartment, though careful viewers noticed she'd angled the camera to hide anything identifiable. I want to sincerely apologize, she began, reading from notes just off camera. My behavior on that flight does not reflect who I truly am. I was having a difficult day, but that's no excuse for making someone feel unwelcome. I have the deepest respect for all people, regardless of. The video lasted 4 minutes. It reached 10 million views. The like-to-dislike ratio was 147. The top comment with 89,000 upvotes. Regardless of what? Say it. You can't even apologize without qualifying. The second. She's sorry she got caught, not sorry she did it. The third was just a link to the clip of Eshe reading her book. Seo-yoon watched that clip obsessed. She watched it in her shrinking apartment. The penthouse lease had expired. The renewal had been delayed indefinitely. She watched it on her phone while former friends stopped returning calls. She watched it late at night when sleep wouldn't come and the walls felt like they were closing in. That moment haunted her more than the removal itself. Because in that 38-second video, Seo-yoon had been performing. Crying, protesting, demanding attention even in her humiliation. She'd been doing what she'd always done, making herself the center of the story. And Eshe had just existed. No performance, no statement, no attempt to control the narrative or capitalize on the moment. She'd been dismissed, defended, and had chosen dignity over drama. The internet had noticed. The internet had chosen. And in choosing, it had taught Seo-yoon something she'd spent her entire career avoiding. Attention without substance is just noise. Dignity without performance is power. One made you famous. The other made you unforgettable. Seo-yoon had chased the wrong one her entire life. And now, watching a schoolteacher with a worn satchel and a children's book become more influential in 3 days than she'd been in 3 years, now she finally understood the difference. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Eshe was grading essays at her kitchen table, the same cracked formica surface where she'd prepared 1,000 lesson plans, where her coffee cups left rings that never quite washed away. Outside, Accra's afternoon heat pressed against the windows. Inside, her fan rotated slowly, moving warm air from one corner to another. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, the kind of paper that announced importance before you even opened it. No return address, just her name in elegant script, Ms. Eshe Anas. She set down her red pen and opened it carefully. Offer of employment. Position: Director of Cultural Curriculum Development. Organization: International School Network, East Asia and West Africa Division. Salary: a number that made her read it 3 times to ensure she hadn't misplaced a decimal point. Responsibilities: design and implement literature and humanities programs across 47 schools in 12 countries. Full autonomy over curriculum development and pedagogical approach. Budget authority for resources, training, and educational innovation. Create scholarship pathways for underserved students across both regions. Reports to Executive Board. At the bottom, in the same elegant handwriting as the envelope, you ran into fire for someone you didn't know. The world needs more educators who run toward difficulty instead of away from it. Taehyung. Eshe's hands were shaking. She read it again, then a third time. Then she set it down on the table and stared at it like it might disappear if she looked away. This wasn't real. This was the kind of position people spent decades building toward. The kind of opportunity that required connections, advanced degrees from Western universities, the right last name, the right network. Not a teacher from Accra who'd never left the continent except for one conference in Nairobi and one very strange flight on a private jet. Her phone rang. Unknown number. International code. She answered hesitantly. "Hello, Ms. Anas." Taehyung's voice, calm and certain. "Did you receive the envelope?" "Ah, yes, but I don't understand." "What don't you understand?" "Why me?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. "There are people with credentials, with experience running programs like this. You're just what?" His tone wasn't unkind, just curious. Eshe looked around her small kitchen. The peeling paint, the second-hand furniture, the stack of student essays waiting to be graded for a salary that barely covered rent. "I'm just a teacher," she said finally.
"No," Taehyung replied.
"You're the person who ran into a burning building without hesitation. You're the person who faced humiliation on my aircraft and chose dignity over confrontation. You're the person who, after being vindicated publicly, opened a book and kept reading. Silence on the line. I've spent 3 years watching people chase power," he continued. "Watching them fight for status, for recognition, for proof that they matter. You're the first person I've met who seems genuinely unbothered by all of it." "That's not true," Eshe said quietly. "I am bothered. That moment on the plane, it hurt. But you didn't break. I wanted to, but you didn't." Taehyung's voice softened slightly. "Do you know how rare that is? To have every reason to respond with anger and choosing not to? To have the world watching and choosing to read a children's book instead of performing for cameras?" Eshe closed her eyes. "I didn't know anyone was watching." "Exactly," he said. "That's why you're qualified. Not despite who you are, because of it." She looked at the offer letter again. At the number that would mean she could stop working 3 jobs. At the scope that would let her reach thousands of students instead of dozens. At the autonomy that would let her teach the way she'd always believed education should work, with dignity, with culture, with the understanding that every child deserved to see themselves in the stories they read. But accepting meant leaving Ghana. Leaving the students she'd fought for. Leaving the familiar struggle for an unknown one. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Good," Taehyung replied. "Fear means it matters. Fear means you understand what's at stake. What if I fail? Then you fail. And try again. That's what educators do, isn't it? Create space for people to learn, even from mistakes." Eshe laughed. Quiet, surprised by her own sound. She picked up her red pen and turned the offer letter over. On the back, she wrote in careful script, "I accept." "I'll do it," she said into the phone. "I know," Taehyung replied. And for the first time in 3 weeks, maybe in 3 years, Eshe Anas let herself believe that running toward fire might actually lead somewhere warm. 6 months after Seat 3A became a hashtag, 2 women woke up in different worlds. Seo-yoon Han opened her eyes in a studio apartment in Gangnam. Still Seoul, still technically the right neighborhood, but 4 floors up in a building with flickering hallway lights and an elevator that broke down twice a month. The luxury penthouse was gone. The doorman who knew her coffee order was gone. The view that had made visitors gasp was gone. What remained fit into 400 square feet. She made instant coffee because the espresso machine had been sold 3 months ago. Sat on a futon that doubled as her bed because the designer furniture hadn't fit through the door. Opened her laptop because her phone had too many blocked contacts, too many unanswered messages, too many reminders of a life that had evaporated like morning fog. Her Instagram account still existed, 18,000 followers remaining from a peak of 2.3 million. She posted occasionally sunset photos, inspirational quotes about resilience, carefully angled selfies that hid the cheap furniture and the peeling wallpaper. The comments were mostly bots now. She scrolled past them to her YouTube recommendations. And there it was, again. Teacher turned education director opens 5th school in rural Ghana. Eshe Anas stood in the thumbnail, surrounded by children in crisp uniforms, a building rising behind her with fresh paint and new windows. Her smile was genuine, unperformed, the kind of joy that came from creating something rather than being photographed pretending to. Seo-yoon clicked. She always clicked. The video showed Eshe cutting a ribbon, shaking hands with village elders, sitting cross-legged with students as they practiced reading aloud. The camera loved her, not because she was performing for it, but because she seemed to forget it was there. Education isn't charity, Eshe said in the interview segment. It's investment. These children aren't recipients of our generosity. They're the future architects of their communities. We're just giving them the tools. The interviewer leaned in. Do you ever think about that moment on the plane? The video that made you famous? Eshe's smile shifted, still warm, but tired around the edges. I think about the fact that a 38-second video of someone being cruel to me got more attention than 30 years of teachers doing this work without cameras. That's the part that stays with me. You seem unbothered by fame. I'm bothered by how much we celebrate the wrong things, Eshe replied gently. Justice shouldn't require going viral. Dignity shouldn't need witnesses. But I'm grateful that moment led here, to work that actually matters. Seo-yoon paused the video, studied Eshe's face frozen on screen. There were wrinkles now that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Smile lines, worry lines, the evidence of someone living fully instead of preserving carefully. Eshe looked older and somehow more alive. More real. Seo-yoon caught her own reflection in the laptop screen. She looked younger. Botox appointments were one of the last luxuries she'd maintained. The final defense against an industry that had discarded her anyway. Smooth skin, perfect angles, and absolutely hollow. Across the world, Eshe Anas closed her laptop in a hotel room in Kumasi. Tomorrow she'd visit the 6th school site, meet with architects, interview teaching candidates, review curriculum proposals for the expansion into Senegal and Kenya. The work was exhausting, endless. Some days she missed the simplicity of one classroom, 30 students, problems she could solve with a good book and patient listening. But then she'd receive letters from students in programs she'd designed, from teachers implementing her curriculum, from parents who watched their children read for the first time. Legacy wasn't loud. It didn't trend, didn't generate headlines, didn't make you famous in the way the world measured fame. But it lasted. She thought about Seo-yoon sometimes, wondered if the woman had found peace, hoped she had genuinely, because carrying that much fear and insecurity was its own kind of prison. Eshe had been humiliated on that plane, but Seo-yoon had been humiliated by her own choices, and that was a deeper wound. 2 women. One had chased visibility and lost everything when the cameras turned away. One had chosen substance and built something cameras couldn't capture. Seo-yoon had one attention. Eshe had one legacy. And in the mathematics of a life well lived, only one of those currencies compounded over time. Seo-yoon closed her laptop. The studio apartment felt smaller than it had that morning. Eshe opened her window. Tomorrow she would teach children who would teach children who would change the world. And somewhere above the Indian Ocean, an empty seat on a private jet had become a dividing line between 2 kinds of power. The kind that demands to be seen, and the kind that changes what's worth seeing. Only one of them would be remembered. The classroom in Accra smelled like fresh paint and possibility. 42 students sat at new desks, donated by Taehyung's foundation, assembled by community volunteers, polished by parents who'd watched the school rise from foundation to finished building in 8 months. Sunlight poured through windows that actually closed, illuminating walls covered in maps and posters showing authors from every continent. Eshe Anas stood at the front holding a book. Not the worn children's story from her satchel, though that sat on her desk like a talisman. This was new. A collection of African folktales she'd helped publish, stories that had been passed down orally for generations, now preserved in print with illustrations by local artists. Who can tell me, she asked, what makes a story powerful? A girl in the second row raised her hand tentatively. When it's true. Truth is part of it, Eshe agreed. What else? A boy near the window spoke up. When it teaches something? Yes, And silence. Then a small voice from the back. When it shows us who we could be. Eshe smiled. The real kind. The kind that started in her chest and radiated outward. Exactly. Stories are mirrors and windows. They show us ourselves and let us see into other lives. That's why representation matters. Why we need to read stories where we recognize our own faces, our own struggles, our own victories. She opened the book. Today we're going to read about Anansi the spider, a trickster who used intelligence instead of strength, who proved that cleverness and courage matter more than size or power. The students leaned forward. Eshe began to read. And in that moment, teaching children who would grow up knowing their stories mattered. Their voices deserved to be heard. Their dreams were valid. She felt something she'd chased for 30 years finally settle into place. Purpose. Not the kind that required validation. Not the kind that needed cameras or hashtags or viral moments. The kind that accumulated quietly, one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one life changed at a time. 7,000 miles away, Seo-yoon Han sat in her studio apartment, watching the school's opening ceremony on a tablet propped against her coffee cup. The live stream showed Eshe cutting another ribbon, children singing, community leaders giving speeches about investment in the future. Taehyung in the background, hands in his pockets, watching with the satisfaction of someone who'd placed a bet on the right person. The comments section scrolled past. This is what real beauty looks like. Imagine if we celebrated educators the way we celebrate models. She saved a life and now she's saving thousands more. Seo-yoon's finger hovered over the comment box. What could she possibly say? I'm sorry I tried to make you small when you were already building something so much larger than I could comprehend. I spent my whole life chasing attention and you spent yours building legacy, and I finally understand the difference. I was terrified of becoming invisible, and in protecting my own fragile status I made myself into exactly the kind of person the world should forget. She closed the tablet. Some apologies were too late. Some damage couldn't be undone with words. But she could learn. Even in obscurity. Even in this small apartment with the flickering lights and the broken elevator. Even with no cameras, no audience, no one watching to validate that she was changing. She could choose differently. It wouldn't erase what she'd done. Wouldn't restore what she'd lost. But it was a start. Eshe closed the folktale book as the afternoon light began to fade. Tomorrow, she told her students, we'll talk about your own stories. The ones you want to tell. The ones the world needs to hear. 42 faces looked back at her with something she recognized. The same hunger she'd felt at 8 years old, surrounded by books in her grandmother's kitchen, believing that words could change worlds. They were right to believe it, because here, in this classroom built on dignity instead of humiliation, on investment instead of charity, on the kind of power that lifted instead of pushed down, here, stories were already changing everything. 38,000 feet above the Indian Ocean, status had been measured in leather seats and silence. But on the ground, in classrooms across continents, true power was being measured differently. Not in who you excluded, but in who you elevated. Not in how famous you became, but in how many futures you helped create. Not in moments that went viral, but in work that lasted long after the cameras stopped watching. Some people chase attention. Some people build legacy. And on a private jet that had become a symbol, power had chosen the wrong side. Until a man with a scar and a memory decided it was time for power to choose differently. The woman who had been pushed down rose higher than anyone imagined. The woman who did the pushing learned that cruelty eventually collapses under its own weight. And somewhere between humiliation and redemption, the world learned a lesson it kept forgetting. True power doesn't need to make others smaller. It just builds bigger tables.